The last talk in our series, Social Doctrine of the Church with the emphasis to political science, will deal with property, resources and the environment, which are three related areas that will tackle the concept of private property within the social teachings of the Church, the issue of national resources, two issues which we've touched upon in a number of areas in our discussions, but which we'll bring together holistically in this last presentation, but also another important aspect, which is environment and sustainability, something which the Church is giving a lot of importance to, even with the more recent teachings issued by Pope Francis in Laudate Si. Property. We can define property or the areas of focus in four areas. Private property, a home, means of production like a factory or an office or a bank, any business property, natural resources, and the environment. These are all aspects dealing with property around us. Now, when it comes to private property, the Church deems private property as essential to ensure that we give every individual freedom and dignity. Remember, the social teachings of the Church had started precisely with Rerum Novarum, with a reality that workers from peasants, if you remember in Talk 1, who owned a piece of land, becoming workers in a factory, but having no property of their own. So having to live in cities, renting property where to live, and therefore not having ownership. The Church does not see that as a very positive thing. Actually, the Church promotes the concept of home ownership, of every individual should have his home, or a family should have her home. And that is within the concept of guaranteeing freedom and dignity to persons and for helping each of them to meet their basic needs. So private property, according to Gaudium Express, or some ownership of external goods, because property is not just land, but you may have also other external goods, like a car, on everyone is a sphere wholly necessary for the autonomy of the person and the family, and should be regarded as an extension of human freedom. So private property in itself gives dignity to every individual and autonomy and independence. However, the Church teaches that private property is not an absolute right. And this is the context which we will be talking when we touch upon the issues of resources and the environment. So, private property is not an absolute right, and so the possession of material goods has limitations when there is the issues relating to also the common good. So, the Church in Centesimus Annus, Pope John Paul II, in Clause 30 says that the use of goods, while marked by freedom, is subordinate to their original common destination as created goods, as well as to the will of Jesus Christ as expressed in the Gospel. So, it also quotes St. Thomas Aquinas and says, but if the question be asked, how must one's possessions be used? The Pope says, the Church replies without hesitation that man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all. And therefore, there is this responsibility in each and every one of us who owns possessions, that our possessions are not just for ourselves, but also for others. So property is the basis of service to others. And so Pope Benedict XVI, in one of his Angelus messages in 2007, emphasized this understanding of property, telling us, using the parable of the dishonest servant, who, if you remember, started distributing the goods of his owner to make friends with people because he was going to be fired, and saying, we should be using what God gave us in the same way, not to abuse of others, but to make friends of others, to show solidarity. God has given us his richness to show solidarity with others. However, to put at mind and the rest to the families that have their home but can't say that they are rich, this within reason. So, in Rerum Novarum, the Pope says, "No one certainly is obliged to assist others of what is required for his own necessary use or that of his family." So while we are called to be generous, that does not mean we do not provide for the needs of our families and our children what they need and give what they need to others to show that we are generous. So our responsibility as parents, as household, as a family, is first to provide for our family. But that which is extra to us, we should also be generous with and share with others. So there is boundaries within which the Church asks for our generosity. But clearly, property should be used in two ways: for mercy, kindness and charity, and therefore this aspect we talked about of generosity. But also, the Church teaches, can be used to create, through wealth and property, to create jobs for others. So if I have a property which I transform in a business that employs people, the Church sees that as a way in which you are fulfilling God's intention that property is used for the common good of others. That we are actually using our property, our knowledge, our ability to help other families also have a livelihood by creating jobs for those families. Now, where is the relationship between the state and private property? So if the Church emphasizes the need that people are given the right for private property, where is the role of the state in all this? Now, the state has a role in contributing to the universal destination of goods. The state is actually responsible to see that the objective of the universal destination of goods is reached, and therefore where human generosity is not sufficient, the state comes in. That's why there is taxes, that's why, as we've seen earlier, government collects money to have social benefits, to have programs, to support others, so the benefits of society are shared amongst many, or better shared amongst all. However, the universal destination of goods should not be a license to the state to take over all property and manage it himself. So again, the Church moves away from the communist notion of the state assuming all property, so all property is of the state in the name of the common good. No. As we said, having property is an issue also of dignity, of human value, of also identity. So there needs to be a balance. So the state may own property if it is for the common good, but shouldn't use that reason to usurp all property and take control in the notion of common good. That would be an abuse by any state. So property is a means for the human being to flourish, to have a home, to create a business. And therefore the state, while having a right to have taxation on property, cannot do so as a means to drain and exhaust that property. So it is wrong to usurp the property and to claim all property being of the state. But it is equally wrong for the state to say, okay, the property is yours, but I'll tax it so much that basically it's better if you give me your property. That is equally wrong. So the right for the state to possess property is only when it is needed for the public good and not as a means to absorb all property. And therefore the state should allow for every individual to have his house. Actually, I believe it is a good thing that the state encourages families to be homeowners because it gives them more certainty, independence, as the church teaches, that businesses have their own property to be able to create wealth and jobs. But then there may be situations, and this is where we're going into now, especially when in relation to the environment and natural resources, that the state has an important role to play. And in Populorum Progressio, Pope Paul VI says, when private gain and basic community needs conflict with one another, it is for the public authorities to seek a solution to these questions with the active involvement of individual citizens and social groups. So there the church, when there is a conflict between the interest of the few and the common good, it is the role of the state to address those situations. Let's take the issue of natural resources. And I will start with asking the question, why are the resource richest nations have, why do countries which have a lot of resources effectively have the poorest people in their population? Why is that? Let me give you an example. Nigeria is Africa's biggest oil producer. It also is one of the countries that has the highest rate of poverty. 80 million people, half of the population of this country, of Nigeria, earn less than $2 a day, so are poor in that country. Why is this happening? And the World Bank Vice President for Africa, in an interview he had given, gave an answer. Because he said, since independence in 1960, 400 billion worth of oil revenue has been stolen from Nigeria. Stolen by whom? By the politicians and the companies, these multinational companies that benefited from the oil in Nigeria. And therefore this money did not go to develop this country. And this is why we need governments that seriously address this issue. If you look at the map in slide 12, you realize that the countries with the richest resources, the yellow countries, are primarily all in the southern hemisphere of the world. The northern hemisphere of the world, where there is Europe, America, Russia, have less of natural resources. But I will throw you again the slide we've seen in the previous presentation, where we said 32 million people control 41% of the world's wealth. Now on slide 13, you realize that the wealth is on the northern hemisphere and poverty is on the southern hemisphere. So the southern hemisphere has all the wealth in terms of resources. But this wealth is not being benefited by the people of those countries, but by the people of the northern hemisphere. And this is a grave injustice, but happens, as we've seen in the previous presentation, because of corrupt governments that actually use the country's resources to retain power, but also for their own personal gain. Let's take Brazil as an example. Brazil is one of the countries which has huge industrial potential. It has iron ore, manganese, nickel, granite, limestone, clay, sand, gold, platinum, uranium, gems, petroleum, timber. It has also natural gas, crude petroleum, but also major agricultural products like cocoa, coffee, beef, pork, soybeans, tomato, cotton. There's a lot of potential in Brazil. And yet, as Oxfam, which is an international organization that monitors poverty, Brazil still has extreme levels of poverty. The country's 5% richest have, in total, the income of 95% of the remaining population in Brazil. This is crazy, the disparity that exists in Brazil. 16 million people in Brazil are still below the poverty line. And when you look at economic growth, there has been a lot of economic growth in Brazil. 61% of that economic growth went to 10% of the population. And the rest, the 90% of the population, had to share 39% of the growth. If you measure minimum wage in Brazil, it will take a person earning the minimum wage 19 years to earn what a person who is on the top 0.1% of Brazil, what that person earns in 1 month. And for Brazil women to close the wage gap with Brazilian men, it will take them up to 2047. And Brazil is a resourceful, rich country. So why is a resourceful, rich country having so much disparity and inequality? Because basically there is mismanagement of the resources of that country. So let's ask the basic question: who owns natural resources? Now, natural resources, to define them, are the resources not usually, below the surface of the earth. So oil, gold, gas, and all silver, and all these other items, diamonds, that come from extraction. Now, surface resources are generally, internationally, and in most national structures, deemed to be owned by the person who owns property. So if I have my home and put solar panels to generate electricity, that electricity technically is mine, even though the sun is of everyone and energy is of everyone, but because it is on my land, it is mine. However, when it comes to natural resources, usually governments have a perimeter. They say, up to a certain level of debt, whatever you find is yours. But beyond a certain level of earth debt, then that is of the state. That is why coal, gas, oil is of the state and not of the individual. So over my house, I start suspecting that there is oil under me, and I get a driller and start drilling for oil and find oil. That oil is not really mine, even though it will take me a long time to actually drill till where probably you'll find oil. That is of the state. However, international law recognizes a concept which in itself is good, but which is creating problems, which says that every state has a right to sell the country's resources. Well, all well and good. But what if the state is not run by a democracy and is run by a tyrant? What right does he have to sell the resources of that country unfairly and unjustly, when you see what compensation then the population is getting in that society? And therefore, the church recognizes the right of property, but recognizes also the right of the state to own these strategic assets. Because, as we said, it is important to manage them for the benefit of all. But if the state is not managing them in the benefit of all, then that is clearly illegitimate. And then slide 18 actually depicts how this would happen. So usually you'd have a coup, so the democratic government is toppled and you have a dictator. What does the dictator do in this resource-rich country? He starts extracting the resources, selling them cheaply to other countries. The money he gets, he corrupts all the officials around him to buy loyalty and to buy weapons to control the population. And that guarantees that corrupt government length of stay as a government. And we see this with a lot of tyrants in the world that have been there for 40 years, even more than 40 years, because nobody is able to resist them. That is a clear example where international community should not allow that state, even though it is internationally a state, to use those resources for that wrong purpose. In reality, a lot of governments hide under this international recognition of the right of the state to sell the resources of a country without asking the question, but is the government, is the state legitimate? And by not asking the question, they close their eyes to the injustice that is happening in those countries. But let me be very frank, it doesn't mean that every democratic government has the legitimate right to dispose as he likes of the resources of that country. First of all, because the resources are not intended for one generation, but there is an intergenerational responsibility. And secondly, you can also have democratic governments who actually are closer to dictatorships than to democracy. So they get elected, yes, but they manipulate the elections. They still around them have what are called, and this happened a lot in the Eastern European countries, called oligarchs, who when those countries moved away from communism and entered into a market economy, rather than adopting the good principles of good governance in terms of market economy, the economies ended up being run rather than by the state, by very few called oligarchs who bought cheaply the public companies from the state for their profits, and the profits of the politicians who sold them in corrupt ways those assets to benefit the few. That is also a sort of tyranny. It may be guised under democracy, but in reality it is also a form of tyranny. So who should benefit from resources? Clearly, the beneficiaries from resources should be the best interests of the people. So the question needs to be asked, from the resources that are extracted, what share is going to the development of the people in that country? But as we've seen in the previous slide, because of corruption, misappropriation, wrongful spending, the influence of these international companies, multinational companies, unfortunately is creating a very different reality. So is it simple to say the best thing is that resources, natural resources, are extracted by the government rather than by the private sector? Well, in reality, there are the pros and cons on both sides of the coin. When resources are extracted by the private sector, then the state needs to assume a role that the right share of profits made from that extraction goes to the country of origin. So that money goes to development of its people. That is a very important principle. Secondly, profits should be taxed in the country where the extraction happens. Now, what is happening in many countries is, because of a lot of tax avoidance measures, you open a company in a jurisdiction somewhere so that the profits you make on the extraction you transfer to that company, to that country with low tax status. That is actually taking away the money, the legitimate money that should have been made by the government on behalf of the people of the state that owned those resources. Clearly, there needs to be strong anti-corruption mechanisms to detect and punish politicians and also companies that enter into corrupt relationships. And there need to be checks and balances, because unfortunately people are very easily prone to corruption, even though the operation is run through the private sector. These risks also emanate when the extracting company is a nationalized company, so a company owned by the state. Unfortunately, what we have seen happening in a lot of countries, when you have these situations, the money does not always go into state coffers, but is misappropriated through accounts in hidden jurisdictions, where a lot of the money made by the companies through the officials who are corrupt goes in their pockets rather than in the coffers of the state. So even there you need strong anti-corruption and detection mechanisms, and even there need to be a lot of checks and balances to ensure that the benefits are really gained by the nation. This is a big temptation, a big problem internationally, because obviously money made from resources is big. So there is a lot of way how everybody can chip his piece. Moving into the last aspect of our teaching is the environmental concern. And as I said, The Church has consistently expressed concern through various teachers, Patres in Terris by Pope Paul VI, Redemptor Hominis by John Paul II, and even Pope Benedict addressed this issue and this concern that humanity is destroying itself because it is destroying its environment. So this economic model that we have created is taxing heavily our environment and destroying our environment. So, and the natural environment, as John Paul II said, has become merely an immediate use and consumption. The environment has also become something that we consume. And Pope Benedict says, unless we eliminate the structural causes of the dysfunctions of the world economy and correct models of growth, which have proved incapable of ensuring respect for the environment. So on the need that we create these new models that respect the environment. And I think a fundamental document today in the social teachings of the Church is Laudato Si. Actually, Laudato Si has been described by many experts in the field as a document which goes beyond the environment. It actually is the social teachings which touches on the economy, finances, politics, migration, poverty, peace, urban architecture, planning, education, human rights, and the environment, even though it emanates from this concept of having a common home, that the world is a common home. As I said, it addresses various themes. We will not be able in these minutes that we have to go in the various aspects of the document, but I will touch on some important issues. And I think a fundamental question which the Pope asks through Laudato Si is, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to our children? What kind of world are we leaving to our future generations? And I think, as you see in the slides, we're not leaving a very positive world. If you see at the sea, today there is a land of plastic which man has created through his garbage, not because we intentionally created, but because we've thrown so much plastics in the oceans that there is actually, through the currents, the creation of a whole piece of floating plastic land which is bigger than Texas in the United States. It's actually 4 times Texas in the United States, which is one of the biggest pieces of biggest states in the US. So you realize the environmental damage we are creating. Pollution and climate change is a big issue that is addressed by this document. But this document makes an emphasis that neglect of the environment and the damage we are creating to the environment through population and climate change, the biggest impact is on the poor peoples of society, because usually these live on the margins of society where, because of global warming, there are more droughts, so less ability to grow crops. The desert in Africa is growing, or else they live by the coast, and we know again with global warming the North and South Pole, the Arctic, is melting more quickly, so sea levels are growing, so villages are actually being wiped out, and therefore there is a big social impact because of the environmental impact. We are destroying ourselves. By not caring for the world, we are actually destroying ourselves. And the Pope says, therefore, that the greatest impact of this change falls on the poorest, but many of those who possess more resources and economic and political power seem mostly to be concerned with masking the problem and concealing the symptoms. So the Pope is saying, it is there for us to see, but the people in power seems more interested in denying these realities, obviously to remain inactive and not to be pushed into doing something about it. Water is an important aspect that this document addresses and expresses concern that water is being privatized, that rather than being a public good, water is becoming also something you need to buy, and the poor cannot afford to buy water. Actually, they have a problem with water reaching them. So if you privatize water and this tribe lives in a very remote place in Africa, there's no monetary incentive for the company that runs the water system to actually go and provide water to those people, because it starts saying it's too costly to give them water. So what? We displace whole population, and this is something which the church says, that safe drinking water is a basic and universal human right, and therefore that should not be privatized. Biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity, with the massive development we are seeing, we are losing a lot of species of animals possibly we've never seen, and that is why possibly we do not care, because we do not care about what we do not see. But in reality, the church teaches and science teaches us that biodiversity is a whole ecosystem. When we lose biodiversity, we may be losing the medicine of the future that we will need to save us, that we may actually lose things that in the future are needed also to sustain the equilibrium. Like science teaches us that if we lose sharks, and many people are afraid of sharks, we will lose the ocean's ecosystem, because sharks keep the eco-balance in the sea of all the sea creatures. So we think that we can hunt sharks because they're a dangerous species, when in fact sharks are important for our own future. And this is why the church again emphasizes the need not to lose biodiversity. Things closer, things that we can understand. The Amazon or the Congo basins, which are massive forests, which are the breathing of humanity, of our lives. They create the oxygen we need. And there are pressures today, like to internationalize the Amazon. So the Amazon doesn't remain of the Brazilian people or of the countries that have the Amazon passing through it, but becomes under international control. Why, the Pope asks? To allow bigger economic interests to control the Amazon rather than the people who live round the Amazon? And the church questions this sort of discussion that is happening internationally, and speaks about the need to make sure that economic interests do not outweigh the environmental needs of the whole world. If we lose the Amazon, there will be huge respiratory problems in the whole world, because it is very important for the whole ecosystem. Then it also talks about mental pollution, technology, and this rapid information glut that we are receiving through social media, through information technology. And the reality that we are becoming, relationship-wise, disconnected from each other, less interpersonal, less together, only together on a screen that you can wipe away very quickly if you're not interested in what the screen is telling you. And therefore, this is also harmful, says the Pope, because it is creating isolation. And as we said, the Pope emphasizes that the victims of all this are primarily the poor and the vulnerable. And therefore he says, because you have a lot of environmentalists that talk about the environment, but he links poverty and the environment together by he says that we need to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, because these are many times caused by the same effects. And also the Pope talks about the need of a paradigm shift of the way we look at the globe, we look at the environment and the impact we are leaving on the environment. The need that we do not control developing countries. Many developing countries are controlled today because of their debt, as we have discussed earlier, and therefore continue to fuel this unjust economy where the developing countries are those that gain most from the resources of the developing country. And there is therefore no room, the Pope says, for a globalization of indifference. We need leadership, the Church says, leadership that is capable of striking out new paths, that is able to establish an international legal framework which can set clear boundaries and ensure the protection of ecosystems that is becoming indispensable. So there is a big responsibility on political leaders globally to ensure that we save the world for ourselves and for our future. But as we said, the world faces in general two extremes. Either people who completely deny that this is happening, and even states that deny that this is happening, or others which just see the catastrophe without coming up with solutions. And the Church urges a dialogue in this sense to be able to find an integral approach. The Church calls it the integral ecology as a way forward where together we find solutions through the respect of all human beings. So again, in reality, it's affirming the basis of the social teachings of the Church. Equality, respect for humanity, the relationships that surround us. It has to be based on the preferential option for the poor, who are our brothers and sisters, and that we have to realize that when we talk of integral ecology, it's not just about nature, where we have not yet built, but also in our urban areas we need to have more integral space. And so the Church goes into a lot of aspects on environmental protection, on the need to encourage an honest debate to find these solutions, a balance between the business ventures and the projects that demand more transparency to make sure that these are not influenced by corruption to the detriment of humanity and the resources that we should be sharing. At the end, and I close with this theme, which we started in the beginning, it is all about the moral values we have. Unless we develop moral character, and that is why the Pope emphasizes our encounter with God that gives us this moral perspective to life, then we are doomed to fail. And the Pope says, if we scan the regions of our planet, we immediately see that humanity has disappointed God's expectations. And with that message of Pope Francis, I thank you for following this 8 talks series on the social teachings of the Church and political science, and I wish you all the best and thank you for this opportunity.